All right. So the first section we're going to talk about is called dog whistle politics. So we're just going to quickly kind of go through what this is and how it works, just so we're prepared for the next section. The next section is going to be about the Southern strategy, which is basically um, how the Republican Party created a political strategy around dog whistle politics in the 60s and still are using it today. So we're going to dive really deeply into how the history of this in the next session, but I just want to talk about what it is first, just so we're all kind of on the same page. And if you want to dive a little bit really deeper into this, Ian Haney Lopez writes this amazing book, Dog Whistle Politics, which is really the one of the better histories of the rise of the modern Republican Party in the 50s and 60s, and how they've used dog whistle politics. Every president since then has used, dog whistle politics. So the first thing we need to talk about, we talked briefly about this in the intro, but strategic racism. So I want to kind of talk a little bit more about this because this is important to understand. Because a lot of times, we, it's actually, strategically been taught to us that racism is this intentional thing done by bad, evil people. And yes, I mean all racism is bad, but there's a lot of people that push racism not because necessarily they believe in it, but because they recognize how much power and how much votes they can get from it, and how much wealth they can get from it. So strategic racism is intentionally using racial animus as leverage to gain wealth, political power, heighten social standing, etc. So like we're going to talk about in the next section, we're going to talk about a lot of the founders of the modern Republican Party, like Wallace, Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon. A lot of them at a certain time point in their careers were very pro civil rights, and they actually voted on a lot of civil rights bills. George Wallace actually, his first time he running for governorship, he actually he rebuked the KKK tried to endorse him, and he rebuked it, and then actually he earned NAACP's endorsement, but then he lost horribly because most of the voters were wanting more racist candidates. So he learned very quickly that he can, if he goes the other direction and starts talking more about racism but do it in a more coded way, he could gain a lot more votes. And the next time the next governor election in Alabama, he did just that, and he won by a landslide. And same with Goldwater and Nixon, they all realized that if they coded this racism, made it more socially acceptable, and then pushed it, they can win a lot more voters, and they did win a lot more voters. I mean, Nixon almost lost his 68 campaign because he wasn't pushing enough racist policies and enough racial dog whistles, and actually Wallace was outdoing them in the South. So he quickly changed. He worked with Strom Thurmond, a couple people, and changed his direction, and all of a sudden he won that. And then this next election he went all in on racial dog whistles and racism, and he won more voters than LBJ in '64. So it's I'm not, trying to, cover, I'm not trying to, say these people are good people, or if there's good, I'm not talking good or bad. I'm just saying these people realize that especially in the politics world, you can win a lot of white voters by going towards the racist route. So I want to read this one quote from Ian Haney Lopez. He talks about equating dog whistling with personal bigotry minimizes the phenomenon. It's not an expression of prejudice so much as coldly calculated decision to seek advantage by manipulating the prejudice in others. Dog whistling is a strategy. And LBJ, I mean, he had talked, he talked about this a long time ago, where there's this famous quote. He says, "I'll tell you what's at the bottom of it. If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, he'll give him somebody to look down on, and he'll even empty his pockets for you." And that's because a lot of times these strategies are used by people, politicians trying to push what we call neoliberal policies, which are basically attacks on New Deal programs and Great Society programs, Great Society's, LBJ's, programs. So a lot of times they're using this to push, things like, rich tax cuts, corporate welfare, privatization of social services, mass incarceration, and at the same time, while they're trying to cut, social safety nets, environmental, economic deregulations, reducing unions, Liz Plank, summarizes this really well. She says, convincing white people that black people are the biggest threat to their safety is the Republican Party's most effective way to distract their white base from noticing that Republican policies are the ones killing them softly. And I think, Hannity Lopez, writes also, nothing testifies to dog whistle racism's transformation in American politics over the last half century so much as the recent willingness of 3 out of 5 white voters to support tax cuts for the super rich, reduce social services for everyone, and dramatically roll back of all government. Dog whistle racism has helped convince many whites, arguably even the majority, that the greatest danger they face comes from liberal government and hawk to minorities rather than concentrated wealth and its plutocratic agenda. And you can see this, we see this like since the 70s, our wages have stayed the same despite the fact that our productivity are coming up. And we're literally having not improved our wages since, the 70s. And it's due to not a lot of neoliberal policies, reductions of unions and minimum wages, deregulations of economic markets, all different kinds of policies that Republicans have been pushing. And they push, but they don't run on these policies. They run on these like racial dog whistle policies. Reagan will say, often said that, talk about welfare queens and how all these black people, you push these narratives that black people were just abusing these systems. So let's cut it all and then give all the money up to rich tax cuts and military contracts. And that's what he did. And $1 trillion of wealth, transferred, to the upper class, while he was convincing everyone it was black people that we had to be worried about. So, same, we see this, since the 80s, we just see this explosion of wealth on the 1%, as, a lot of, the people in the bottom and the middle haven't really seen much gains. And in fact, they've actually lost a lot of wealth since the 80s. At the same time, we see, corporate income taxes, decrease as payroll taxes or taxes that we often, come out of our payrolls, increase. So, a lot of times when these politicians are pushing this racism, or racial dog whistles, or coded racism, a lot of times it's not necessarily to, because they want, they want this racism. A lot of times it's just they want to have policies that make themselves super rich and make their backers super rich. They want to transfer wealth to the top 1%. They want neoliberal policies, but that you can't win voters by that. So instead they try to tell everyone that it's really black people and immigrants and Muslims that we need to worry about. So that's strategic racism. And I'm going to play this quick clip. Ian Hannity Lopez talks about how Ronald Reagan, a great example of how Ronald Reagan harnessed this strategic racism.
So we know Ronald Reagan used to talk about welfare queens, but he also had this other stump speech that he would give. He would speak to his audiences and he would say, understand how frustrating it is for you when you're standing in line at a grocery store waiting to buy a hamburger, and there's some young fellow ahead of you buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Now, the first time he told that tale, it wasn't some young fellow, he said some young buck. And a young buck was a racially coded term that stood for a strong African-American man. And so that term, that moved from being a dog whistle to an outright racial provocation. Reagan backed off and he started talking about some young fellow buying a T-bone steak with food stamps. Think about the characters in this story. The first character is the person buying a T-bone steak with food stamps, and that's conjuring the image of the lazy minority who's strong, who could work, but who doesn't want to work and prefers to be on welfare. But the other image is the you in that story, who Reagan's talking to, and the you is ostensibly the voter, the hardworking taxpayer, the law-abiding American. That voter, that hardworking American implicitly has a racial identity, and that's white. So there you can see this racial narrative. You, Reagan is saying to white audiences, you're being taken advantage of. There's a third character here, government. It's government ostensibly that is taking advantage of whites, that is taking their money through taxes and then giving it to these undeserving minorities. So what did Reagan suggest? He suggested tax cuts. You shouldn't have to pay taxes to a government that's just taking your money and giving it to minorities. And indeed, what did he do? He enacted tax cuts. In the first year of his tax cuts, $164 billion went to American corporations. Over the 1980s, the Reagan tax cuts transferred $1 trillion to America's top 1%. Yes, voters got the tax cuts they thought were aimed at cutting off undeserving minorities. But in fact, it was a politics that was showering money on the very richest Americans. We have to understand the way in which something has fundamentally changed in American politics. We used to understand that the biggest threat in a political life was the power of concentrated money, the power of big money and of corporations to hijack the marketplace and to hijack government. But now Republicans for 50 years have been telling voters the biggest threat in your life is that minorities are going to hijack government. The government has been taken over and now serves them. So when white voters vote against government, they think they're voting against minorities, but in fact, they're voting to give over control of government back to the very rich, back to the big corporations.
All right. There's a lot of different forms of strategic racism, especially around politics, but definitely like the biggest one that I'm aware of, and the one that we're going to spend the most time talking about today. Whether we're talking about the Republican Party or right-wing media or the religious right or Clinton and the New Democrats. They all use this form of strategic racism called racial dog whistle politics. So dog whistle politics in by itself is basically, you think about a dog whistle. A dog whistle is something you blow, where most people can't hear, but then dogs are very aware of it and they can hear it. So it's like this small, it's this very subtle thing that people say that doesn't sound very racist, but people, whether consciously or unconsciously, are reacting to is connecting with racial narratives. So I'll read this quote by Ian Henny Lopez. Racial dog whistles are often sneakily used when politicians want to speak about race specifically to their target audience. The coded messages are used to reinforce racist ideas that the country's societal and economic problems are because of undeserving, lazy, and violent people of color. Dog whistle politics explains how politicians backed by concentrated wealth manipulate racial appeals to win elections and support for regressive policies that help corporations and the super rich in the process wreck the middle class. Racial dog whistle politics, I mean, it's basically a strategy to win over white voters, and by appealing to white racism, appealing to resentment again, and conscious or unconsciously, against Black, Indigenous people of color, civil rights progress, desegregation, things like that. And it's one of the main reasons why, since the 1964, LBJ won the majority of the white vote in the election, and then he passed the civil rights bill. Actually, I believe he did that before the election, but he still won the majority of the white vote, and that's the last time any Democrat has ever won the majority of white votes. The majority of the white voters since then, since the rise of these dog whistle politics, have gravitated, will vote for Republican Party every election, hands down. And that a lot of that, I'm sure there's a lot of reasons to that, but and it's not all about racial dog whistles, but a big part of it is, and that's particularly if you think about 1964. So he just passed the civil rights bill outlawing Jim Crow. At the same time, you have the South that's been told for centuries that they have to white people have to be segregated against Black people because they're violent criminals and rapists. And all of a sudden, then you have a federal government saying we're gonna desegregate everything. You can imagine enormous amount of anger and fear, to the point that Barry Goldwater ran against LBJ in 1964 on an anti-New Deal platform. And if anyone had benefited the most in this country from the New Deal, it was the South. They benefited enormous, millions of people benefited from jobs programs, increased electricity, Tennessee Valley Project, brought electricity to millions of people that never had it before. I mean, the South was literally like millions of people were surviving on the New Deal, and yet majority of the South voted for an anti-New Deal candidate because he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. I mean, that's how powerful of a message this was, and it continues to be to this day. And so a lot of this came about because the 50s and 60s, civil rights movement occurred at the same time that the TVs were starting to go into everyone's household. So all of a sudden, majority of the households, had TVs, and when they turned it on, the one of like three stations would be playing, live footage or recorded footage of the civil rights movement happened down in Alabama, which was brutal. It was basically Bull Connor and all these people, police were sicking dogs on, children, fire hoses, so much brutality. And that, from first time, most people in America, I mean, they thought, we needed Jim Crow. They thought it was like a civilized thing that, to protect, benefit everyone. They started seeing the real brutality of its white supremacy and Jim Crow racism. So suddenly, before this, it was kind of socially acceptable to be a racist. After this period, it was not. And it really motivated a lot of people. Like this footage right here of dogs attacking children, was first time, really John F. Kennedy really started thinking critically about civil rights, and it really pushed him. He admitted that, he was appalled. He had no idea this thing was happening in the South, and that was really pushed towards the civil rights movements and the downfall of Jim Crow. But at the same time, a lot of people still wanted these, racist policies of segregation, of housing discrimination, of a racist criminal justice system and things like that. So instead of pushing for these things outright, they created George Wallace first started doing it. Goldwater, Nixon, Reagan perfected this, but they pushed this coded racism, where they instead of saying things like black people are inferior, using the N word, talk about Jim Crow, and they would instead use this coded racism where they would say, oh, we just want states' rights, instead of talking about protecting segregation, they just made it about states' rights. Now it was like it was like a David versus Goliath thing, where states are the underdogs, and so completely reverse the victimhood, and suddenly the states are the victims for trying to enforce segregation and discrimination. And then Law and Order, Nixon created this because he was cracking down hard on civil rights activists and anti-war activists in black communities. But he wanted, he couldn't, so he stole this idea that they were all criminal, and then he was just restoring law and order. Who doesn't want law and order? Law and order sounds great. We don't want to live in chaos, but in reality, that's only used when cracking down on people protesting, non-violently and violently, protesting their oppression. But busing welfare queens, illegals, are all big ones that they were used. Illegals pushes this idea that undocumented immigrants are criminal when they're not. Most of them, it's just misdemeanor offenses. Most of them are just overstaying visas, or if they do cross the border, illegally, it's a misdemeanor, like jaywalking. But it's more pushed to make people scared of illegals and think they're violent and criminals, and we need to crack down hard on them. A lot of times, so I'm going to read this last quote by Jennifer Lobriel. She writes, ever since the Republican Southern strategy in the 1960s, many politicians have used racial dog whistles to appeal to white Americans, regardless of their politics. Racial dog whistles have even worked on white liberal and moderate voters who might consciously be against racism, but still hold an implicit bias. And that's really important too, because this is not, just a Republican thing. It's not just a right thing. I mean, this is something you'll see in oftentimes with moderates and liberals as well, pushing these ideas. I mean, I think the biggest one is we kept on hearing this backlash against this idea of identity politics, after Trump won in 2016. And that, was just a really nice way to say, let's stop, fighting for civil rights so much, so we can win over more, slightly, racist white, middle class workers, and I mean, and I could see, there's a strategy behind this that, yes, we win more white people over when we don't talk about racism, but instead of just saying that, they code it as just identity politics. It's just a strategy to win an election, rather than, actually recognizing the fact, what does this mean to stop talking about civil rights in the political party. So, it's something it's used, all across the board. I want to play one more video. Ian Lopez is joined by Heather McGhee they're going to do a short video talking about more about dog whistle politics.
If we talk about race, that will end up dividing us. But the hard truth is, we're already divided. And we're divided because there's constant race talk in our society by conservatives. It's just that they're not talking about race expressly, they're using dog whistles. Think about a term like illegal alien, makers and takers, welfare queen, entitlements, freeloaders, people who just want free stuff, inner city crime, drug testing for welfare recipients. What color faces do you associate with those terms? Or think about terms like the silent majority, the heartland, real Americans, hardworking taxpayers. What color faces do you see with those terms? Lyndon Johnson in 1964 is the last Democrat to win a majority of the white vote, and he won in a landslide, campaigning on the promise to end poverty in a generation. And yet, at the same time, racial anxiety is rising in the South because of the civil rights movement. Conservatives sense that they can use racial appeals as a way to win votes. And just 8 years later, Richard Nixon wins in an even bigger landslide, dog whistling about law and order and the silent majority. And then Ronald Reagan brings it home.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say it, but that hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than white. We want to cut this, and we want it's much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than never knew.
He's able to convince many Americans to actually side with the preferences of the 1% by making fear of people of color tied to our very idea of government.
I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
And if government is the problem, Reagan said, then trust the marketplace. And easy as 1, 2, 3. You have the policies that have created massive wealth inequality, all sold to the American public through a narrative of racial resentment.
All right. So we're going to dive deeper into the history of that in the next section. But why don't you talk, really briefly, just a couple, really common dog whistles that we see, even to this day we see. And most of these, we're going to talk about the origins of most of these as well. And I also want to mention too that, you can work on some of these issues without dog whistling. Like we can work on, we can work on fighting crime. We can work on reforming welfare. We can work on, fighting, terrorism and working on immigration systems. I mean, these things, we can reform these systems without being racist or without using racial dog whistles for sure. This isn't, because a lot of people will jump to the conclusion, well, anyone trying to, pass any kind of, criminal justice legislation must be racist. Is that what you're saying? And it's not, we're not saying that at all. A lot of these are issues that do need, reforms. It's just what makes them dog whistles is when people are pushing anti-black and anti-indigenous and xenophobic narratives to push these policies that are really more focused on electing politicians and making transferring wealth to the upper class, as opposed to actually figuring out what's the best way to deal with immigration or what's the best way to deal with crime. So it's important to understand. I mean, like dog whistle politics, many times. I mean, they incorporate things like the dehumanization of non-white people, of marginalized groups, and using these groups and using these fears and these and hatreds and resentments to push policies that ultimately don't benefit anyone. And that's dog whistle politics. So I want to make that distinction, that it's not just anyone who's trying to work on criminal justice reform is racist. That is not true. You can work on these things without pushing racist narratives, and that's what that's where racial dog whistles come in, and then that's a part. Yeah. Okay, so some of these, states' rights is a big one that we hear. It's almost always, it started out in the Civil War, and it's almost always used as this way to push, policies that harm, non-white populations, marginalized populations. So, states' rights came about, with George Wallace and all them in the '60s, where it was really just, instead of fighting, they started out fighting just segregation and civil rights for black people, and instead, and that became unpopular. So then they started making it about states' rights, and it's big government, coming in and telling people what to do and taking away their rights to govern themselves. So, and then cutting taxes, big government, drain the swamp. So these are all things, things that pushes this idea. We're going to have this whole class on racism, racial history of welfare, because this is a lot of this is around this idea that basically liberals, want to waste, white people's money, white taxpayers' money, by overtaxing them and then taking that money and giving it away to undeserving minorities, or just abusing welfare programs, and are becoming dependent. And as long as there's a check, they're not going to find a job, which in reality is just completely untrue. There's very little fraud in these programs. There's a lot of evidence that these programs help a lot of people, and that white people are still the major, recipients of these programs. But despite all that, these narratives are pushed that these programs are just being wasted on black people. And then, so they push these narratives to kind of make huge cuts in welfare reforms, cuts in safety nets, public education, and they transfer that money to corporate welfare, military funding, tax breaks, things like that. Law and order, tough on crime, also Law and Order, Nixon created, to basically criminalize civil rights activists and anti-war activists, so he could violently oppress them and crack down on them, such as like COINTELPRO and different programs, that not only, harassed them, but killed many of these leaders. He turned it into an issue. It wasn't about, whether these, he removed this. The whole point of these movements was about fighting for equal rights and fighting not to be brutalized by police and equality and housing. Instead, he turned it into this law and order, like if you, and silent majority and all this stuff, which we still see today. Right now there's, Black Lives Matter protests all over the country fighting for equality, fighting against police brutality, and then the right, the political right, is turning that into this law and order, that they're all criminals, they're terrorists, and they should be violently, handled and violently suppressed. Welfare queen, welfare reform. Again, this idea that black people on welfare are just abusing the system, and they're taking hard-earning, white people's money. War on terror, Sharia law, radical Islamists, Republicans, during Obama's era were kept on pushing, especially like, Fox News was like, trying to get everyone, them to say the word radical Islamists over and over again. Because this idea is kind of pushing this idea that all Islam is this radical religion that breeds terrorists. So anyone who's a Muslim, we have to be somewhat, could be a potential terrorist. In reality, like, Islam doesn't produce any more terrorists than any other religion, and they don't actually, their religion doesn't produce it. A lot of times it's our foreign policies that radicalize these people, but we'll talk more about that later. Inner city and urban, especially urban is only used with this, and it pushes this idea that cities are where dangerous black and brown people live. You never use the word urban, or inner city. Oftentimes when it's most of the time, particularly on the political right, when Trump says urban or inner city, he's not, it's not a compliment. He's pushing these dangerous myths. Illegal aliens, illegals, falsely implies that undocumented people are criminals, not when in reality these are civil offenses, like jaywalking and parking tickets, and it also implies that Latin American immigrants are criminals and bad people. Thug, when you use the word thug, that's like a more socially acceptable version of the N-word. It's basically, a criminalized black person. Reverse discrimination, reverse racism talks about how it's like and that's often used any kind of policy or system like affirmative action is trying to actually trying to deal with systemic racism. This implies that it's actually it's hurting white people, and this was a big dog whistle that Reagan used. He really pushed the idea of reverse discrimination when talking about things like affirmative action. He attacked affirmative action. He attacked the branches of his government that were responsible for enforcing civil rights cases and stuff. He was constantly attacking and defunding and putting really bad people in charge of these organizations, while claiming it was basically hurting white people. This idea of the zero-sum gain idea that if a black person gains a privilege and gains some equalities, then that's at the cost of white people. In reality, that's not the case. Losing your way of life. This was a big one in 2016. With this idea that that white people, it's much that was all the surveys and exit polls and things after 2016 election talked about. And the biggest thing that why people voted for Trump is they felt like they were losing their way of life because of all the increased diversity and the changing demographics and marginalization. Groups, marginalized groups are suddenly becoming more equal and gaining rights. And so ultimately they felt like their racial hierarchy, their gender hierarchy, all these things that was kind of crumbling down, and they were losing their way of life, which is a very nice way of saying we were losing white supremacy. And then you got Make America Great Again, which actually Reagan started. We'll talk about that, but it pushes this idea that America was a lot better before all these groups got civil rights, and so. All right, and this is the last slide before we start diving into some of the history of this in the next section. But I just want to read this. Keith Boykin, he wrote this really amazing article. I recommend reading the whole thing. It's called "Trading Hoods for Neckties." He says, you can see today's racists don't wear white hoods or scream the N-word. They wear dark suits and scream about government handouts. They don't set up racist polls taxes to deter blacks from voting. They set up voter ID laws to do the same thing. And they certainly don't defend lynch mobs, which legitimizes justice. Instead, they defend stand your ground laws, which achieve the same purpose. The Republican Party has been playing with fire on these issues since the 1960s, when the GOP's Southern strategy began consciously deploying race as a tool to scare working class whites. That's how they convince the very people whose lives depend on government benefits from Medicare, Social Security, Veterans Administration to believe that government, as Ronald Reagan put it, is the problem. Such cognitive dissonance enables white conservatives to see themselves as victims of the very government spending that supports their lifestyles. When they hear the word government, they don't think highways, bridges, food inspection, airline safety, home loan guarantees, mortgage interest deductions, or local public school teachers. Instead, they imagine black people in Harlem, Compton, and Atlanta with their hands out. Nor do they see multinational corporations slashing their pay and outsourcing their jobs to low-wage countries while CEOs take home record salaries. Instead, they see brown-skinned immigrants and black-skinned affirmative action hires as threatening their job security and their way of life. Color has also affected their view on capitalism. This is the evil genius of modern racism. The pinstripe plutocrats have redirected the angst of many working-class whites away from the rich and powerful and toward the power and powerless of let me read that again. The pinstripe plutocrats, and plutocrats and plutocracy is basically a government ran by the rich. So plutocrats have redirected the angst of many working class whites away from the rich and powerful and toward the poor and powerless of color. Never mind that the richest 1% of Americans control 40% of the nation's wealth. Never mind that the world's 85 wealthiest people own as much as 3.5 billion poorest. Instead, white working class conservatives have been taught to focus their antipathy African Americans, whose median household's net worth was about $6,500 in 2011.